The hangar smelled like jet fuel and cold coffee when Marcus Webb heard the laugh that would end a career. It came from Vivian Cross, chief executive of Meridian Air, standing in the doorway of the crew briefing room in a coat that cost more than most people's cars. She was looking at his file. Then she was looking at him. Then she laughed again, short and dry, the kind of laugh that had never once considered the possibility of being wrong. 22 years of flying, 200 combat sorties, a distinguished flying cross. Sitting in a drawer at home next to his daughter's soccer trophies, none of it mattered to the woman in the doorway. "I don't care what the Air Force taught you," she said, loud enough for the other pilots to hear. "This is my airline, and I don't put men like you in my cockpits." Marcus didn't answer. He picked up his flight bag, checked his watch, and walked past her toward the tarmac where a plane was waiting that she didn't know he'd already been assigned to fly. If you've ever been counted out by somebody who never bothered to read your file, somebody who looked at you and decided they already knew everything worth knowing, then you understand exactly what was about to happen next. Stay with this one until the end, because 11 minutes later, air traffic control was going to say a call sign over an open channel that made Vivian Cross put down her coffee and stop laughing for good. 10 days earlier, Meridian Air was a mid-size regional carrier trying to become something bigger. Vivian had taken over as chief executive 14 months prior, after her father, the company's founder, suffered a stroke that left him unable to run day-to-day operations. She had a business degree from a school with a name. People recognized a talent for cutting costs that the board loved, and almost no time logged in an actual cockpit. What she had instead was Russell Kane, her senior director of flight operations, a man who had been with the company 11 years and who had made himself indispensable in exactly the way indispensable men often do, by being the only one who understood how broken the system actually was. Kane ran hiring, he ran scheduling, he ran the internal reviews that decided who got promoted and who got quietly pushed out. And for 11 years, nobody above him had asked too many questions, because the planes kept flying and the complaints, when they came, always seemed to sort themselves out before they reached Vivian's desk. Marcus Webb had applied to Meridian for a senior captain position 2 months earlier. His record was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. Air Force veteran, decorated with over 11,000 flight hours across military and commercial aircraft. He'd spent the last 6 years flying cargo routes for a smaller carrier that had gone under, and he was looking for stability, not glory. Stability. He had a 9-year-old daughter named Della, and stability was the only thing that mattered anymore. He'd interviewed with Kane first. It had not gone well. Kane had barely glanced at the folder. He'd asked Marcus a handful of questions that seemed designed less to evaluate him and more to remind him of his place. And then he'd told him, with a kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, that Meridian would be in touch. Meridian did not get in touch. What Marcus didn't know, and wouldn't know, for another 10 days, was that Kane had a reason for burying his application that had nothing to do with qualifications and everything to do with fear. Because 2 years earlier, Kane had approved a shortcut on a maintenance inspection protocol to save the company 4 days of downtime on a leased aircraft. And that shortcut had never been fully corrected. It had been patched, documented just enough to survive a surface audit, buried under the normal churn of paperwork that a company the size of Meridian generated every single week. Marcus Webb was the kind of pilot who read paperwork the way other people read scripture. Kane had sensed that in the first 4 minutes of the interview, the way a man senses weather changing in his knees. And men like that were dangerous to men like Kane. So the folder went into a drawer, and a note was made in the internal system that the candidate lacked cultural fit. A phrase vague enough to mean anything and specific enough that nobody would ask what it meant. But Meridian was short-staffed. A wave of retirements had hit the senior captain roster all at once, and by the 9th day, scheduling was desperate enough that a junior operations manager, without checking with Kane, pulled Marcus Webb's file back out of the rejection pile and called him directly. Marcus took the call, standing in his kitchen while Della did homework at the table behind him. He listened, he asked 3 questions, and he said yes. He reported for orientation the next morning, and that was the morning Vivian Cross happened to be walking through the operations wing on her way to a budget meeting. And that was the morning she stopped, looked at the tall black man in a crisp Meridian uniform standing at the counter, and asked the receptionist, "Spurs?" in a voice that assumed she wouldn't be overheard, who exactly had approved bringing him on. Nobody had a good answer. Vivian did not like situations without good answers. She pulled his file herself. Read the surface of it. Decorated veteran, strong references, thin commercial resume. By Meridian's usual standard, a resume that read to her eye like a man who'd bounced between smaller operations because nobody bigger wanted him. She did not consider the alternative reading. That a man, with his hours and his record, had been quietly filtered out of bigger opportunities for reasons that had nothing to do with his flying. She called Kane into her office. Kane, sensing an opening he hadn't expected to be handed, told her exactly what she wanted to hear. That the hire had been a scheduling error, that he'd flagged concerns during the interview that had apparently been ignored, that he personally didn't think the man was ready for Meridian's cockpits. Though, of course, he added, lowering his voice, he wanted to be careful how that concern was phrased. Vivian did not need it phrased carefully. She understood exactly what he meant, and she decided in the space of that conversation that Marcus Webb would fly one orientation leg, purely to avoid a discrimination complaint from a same-day termination, and then he would be let go for performance concerns that Kane would be only too happy to manufacture. She did not know his name until she read his file a second time, later that afternoon, standing in the doorway of the briefing room, where he sat quietly reviewing weather data alone, ignored by the other new hires who had picked up, without being told directly, that this was a man not worth being seen with. That was the moment the laugh happened. Marcus absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, without comment, without a flicker of anything on his face that would give her the reaction she seemed to be fishing for. He finished reviewing the weather packet, gathered his things, and walked to the tarmac where Flight 118 to Denver was being prepped for departure and where he was listed, whether Vivian Cross had bothered to check or not, as pilot in command. The first officer that morning was a woman named Priya Shah, 7 years at Meridian, sharp, quiet, and increasingly tired of the culture Kane had built around himself. She'd heard about the exchange in the briefing room within 20 minutes. The way anything humiliating travels faster in an airport than anything true. She met Marcus at the aircraft and did not bring it up. Instead, she handed him the maintenance log and said, "Pre-flight's clean, but I want you to look at something in the number 2 hydraulic system readout. Probably nothing. Numbers looked a little strange to me." Marcus took the log without a word and read it twice. The first time he read it the way anyone would, scanning for red flags, obvious faults, anything flashing. Nothing flashed. The second time, he read it slower, the way he'd been trained to read documents that mattered, tracing the numbers against what he knew the aircraft's history should look like. There was a discrepancy. Small. The kind of small that a rushed inspector, or an inspector told to rush, might sign off on without a second thought. A pressure reading in the auxiliary hydraulic line that didn't match the maintenance interval it should have followed. Marcus didn't say anything about Kane or Vivian or the laugh in the briefing room. He said, "Get maintenance control on the line. I want eyes on this before we push back." Priya didn't argue. She'd flown with captains who postured, who wanted to appear decisive more than they wanted to be right. Marcus wasn't posturing. He was reading the same 3 lines of data for a third time, and something about the stillness with which he did told her this was a man who trusted numbers over instinct and instinct over ego. Maintenance control initially pushed back. A ground supervisor named Doyle, who reported, like everyone else in that hangar, ultimately up through Kane's chain, told them the aircraft had been signed off 2 days prior and the reading was within acceptable variance. Marcus asked to see the underlying inspection sheet, not the summary. There was a pause on the line, long enough to be its own kind of answer. The inspection sheet, when it finally came through, was signed off by a technician whose name Marcus did not recognize, dated the same day as a technician whose name he did recognize, from a previous line of Meridian paperwork he'd been given during onboarding. 2 signatures 1 day apart on documentation that should have taken at minimum 2 full shifts to complete properly. Marcus looked at the 2 signatures for a long moment. Then he picked up the radio and said calmly, that Flight 118 would be delayed for an additional inspection, and that he wanted a licensed technician who reported outside the normal maintenance chain to walk the hydraulic system in person before he'd sign for departure. This was technically within his authority as pilot in command. It was also, he understood immediately, going to be treated as an act of defiance by people who had already decided he didn't belong. Doyle called it up the chain within 6 minutes. Kane took the call in his office with the door closed, and when he emerged, his face had the particular calm of a man rehearsing what he was about to say. He walked to the gate himself. He found Marcus standing at the base of the aircraft stairs, arms crossed, watching a technician he'd requested by name work through the hydraulic access panel with a flashlight and a diagnostic tablet. "You're grounding my aircraft," Kane said, "on your first day, based on a hunch." "Based on a discrepancy in the paperwork," Marcus said. "2 signatures, 1 day apart, on an inspection that takes longer than that to do correctly. Inspections get expedited all the time. Not this one. Not with this reading." Kane's jaw worked for a second. "You don't know how things run here. I know how hydraulic systems fail," Marcus said. "I'd like to keep it that way." It was a short exchange. Kane left with considerably less certainty than he'd arrived with, though his face didn't show it, and Marcus went back to watching the technician work, because the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was already finished. The technician found what Marcus suspected he'd find. A worn seal in the auxiliary line, past its service tolerance, patched during the rushed inspection 2 years earlier with a temporary fix that had been quietly recertified every cycle since, rather than properly replaced, because a full replacement would have grounded the aircraft for 4 days. And 4 days at the time had been judged too expensive. It was not, by itself, an immediate catastrophic risk. That was what made it so easy to hide. It was the kind of flaw that could run for months, sometimes years, without failing. And then, on the wrong day, under the wrong stress, it could fail completely. Marcus filed the discrepancy through the proper internal channel that evening. The same channel every pilot was trained to use, the one that was supposed to route safety concerns above any single manager's ability to bury them. He named the aircraft, the tail number, the 2 conflicting signatures, and the original inspection date 2 years back, that the current documentation seemed to be quietly protecting. He did not accuse anyone by name. He didn't need to. The paper trail did that on its own for anyone willing to actually read it. Kane read it that night, because the routing system which he had designed still gave him visibility into every report before it reached anyone above him. And reading it, he understood, with the particular clarity of a man watching a door he'd nailed shut 2 years earlier, begin to creak open again, exactly how much trouble he was in. He had 2 options. Let it surface and hope his name stayed far enough from the original approval that he could plausibly claim ignorance. Or bury it again faster and more completely, and remove the person who'd found it before anyone above him started asking why a 2-year-old shortcut was suddenly relevant. Kane chose the second option because it was the option that had worked for 11 years. He drafted a memo that night. It described Marcus Webb as a probationary hire who had, on his very first assigned flight, engaged in insubordinate conduct, delayed a scheduled departure without proper authorization, and made unfounded allegations against maintenance personnel that had wasted company resources and damaged morale. He recommended immediate termination, citing conduct unbecoming and failure to integrate with operational standards. And he sent it to Vivian Cross's office first thing the following morning, timed to land on her desk before she'd had coffee. Vivian read it once, quickly, the way she read most things that crossed her desk, looking for the shape of a decision rather than the substance of a story. The shape here was simple. 20 hire, difficult on day 1, senior operations director recommending termination. It matched exactly what she already believed about Marcus Webb from the moment she'd seen his file. It confirmed something she hadn't examined closely enough to know was a bias. Rather than a judgment, she signed the termination. Marcus was informed by a curt email before his second scheduled flight, informing him his employment with Meridian Air was terminated effective immediately, citing insubordination and unauthorized operational delays. There was no meeting, no opportunity to respond, just a message and a request to return his badge. He read it twice. The first time, the way anyone reads bad news, scanning for whether there was some mistake, some detail that made it less final than it looked. The second time, slower the way he read. Everything that mattered, understanding exactly what had happened and exactly why. The shortcut he'd found, suddenly recontextualized as the reason he was being removed, rather than the reason he should have been thanked. He did not call anyone screaming. He did not write an angry reply. He sat at his kitchen table where Della was drawing at the opposite end, and he read the termination email a third time, and then he closed his laptop and helped his daughter finish her drawing of a house with too many windows. Because that was the kind of thing that still needed doing regardless of what Meridian Air decided about him. But Marcus had made a career, both in the military and out of it, out of documenting everything. He had copies of the maintenance discrepancy report, he had timestamps, he had the 2 conflicting inspection signatures. He'd flagged, saved to a personal drive before Kane's team could quietly amend the internal record, which they did, less than 18 hours after his termination, replacing the version Marcus had flagged with a cleaner one that made the second signature disappear entirely. They did not realize he'd already saved a copy. They also did not realize that Priya Shah, the first officer who had first pointed him toward the strange reading, had filed her own internal note corroborating the sequence of events because she had seen enough of Kane's operation over 7 years to recognize exactly what was happening, and she was done staying quiet about it. 10 days passed. Meridian Air, scheduled, Flight 118, again the same aircraft, repaired now the hydraulic seal properly replaced rather than patched, though the paperwork trail describing why it had been replaced remained for the moment buried inside an internal system that only a handful of people had reason to look at closely. Vivian Cross, meanwhile, had begun to notice something she couldn't quite name. A discomfort that sat in the back of her schedule the way a stone sits in a shoe, small enough to ignore for a while, persistent enough that eventually you have to stop and deal with it. It had started with a phone call from the Federal Aviation Administration's regional office, a routine follow-up regarding an anonymous safety disclosure filed through the agency's whistleblower channel, referencing a tail number Vivian recognized from Kane's termination memo about Marcus Webb. She had not known, until that call, that pilots could file safety concerns directly with federal regulators when they believed internal channels had failed them. She had not known because she had never needed to know how thoroughly that process protected the person filing. The agency was not accusing Meridian of anything. Yet, they were simply requesting documentation. Full maintenance history on the aircraft in question, dating back 3 years, copies of every inspection sign-off, a timeline of the Flight 118 delay and subsequent findings. Vivian called Kane into her office and asked him to pull the records. Kane told her it would take a few days to compile, which was true because the records that would satisfy the FAA's request were not the records currently sitting in the system, and assembling something that looked complete without revealing what had actually happened was going to take careful work. While Kane worked on that, Vivian did something she rarely did. She went down to the hangar floor herself without an assistant, without an agenda that anyone had prepared for her, and she asked a maintenance supervisor, a woman named Ortiz who'd been with the company 19 years, what she remembered about the Flight 118 delay. Ortiz did not know she was supposed to be careful. She told Vivian plainly that the delay had been caused by a captain who'd caught something everybody else had missed, that the seal really had been bad, that it should have been replaced 2 years earlier, and that half the maintenance floor had quietly known about the shortcut back then and had simply assumed it had eventually been handled properly, because nobody wanted to be the one to say otherwise to Kane's face. Vivian asked, which Captain Ortiz told her. The black pilot, new hire, got fired the next day, which everybody on the floor thought was strange, given that he was the reason they'd caught it at all. Vivian did not say anything to that. She thanked Ortiz and walked back to her office, and for the first time in 14 months of running Meridian Air, she felt the particular vertigo of realizing that a decision she'd made with total confidence might have been built on nothing at all. She pulled Marcus Webb's termination file again that evening. Read the memo Kane had written, read it a second time, slower, and noticed for the first time that it did not once describe what the actual discrepancy had been. It described Marcus as insubordinate and disruptive. It did not describe a worn hydraulic seal or a 2-year-old shortcut or 2 signatures a day apart on an inspection that should have taken longer than that. It talked around the problem so completely that she realized, reading it now with different eyes, that the memo had been engineered not to inform her but to move her past the details as quickly as possible. She called Marcus Webb directly. It took her assistant 20 minutes to find a working number, since his contact information had already been purged from the employee system as part of the termination processing. Marcus answered on the 4th ring. He was in his garage, where he did most of his thinking, an orderly space with a workbench along one wall and a corkboard of Della's school photos above it, the kind of small, deliberate order that stood in total contrast to the disorder Vivian had just started to uncover inside her own company. Vivian identified herself. Marcus recognized her voice immediately and did not raise his own to match the moment. "I read your memo again," she said. "It didn't describe the actual maintenance issue at all." "No," Marcus said, "it wouldn't. I'd like you to walk me through what happened, not what Kane wrote. What actually happened." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You already fired me for it once. Why does it matter now?" It was not an emotional question. It was, in its way, the most direct question anyone had asked her in 14 months, and she found she didn't have an easy answer. "Because the FAA is asking questions. I can't answer, honestly, with what's currently in my system," she said. "And because I think I made a decision based on who I assumed you were, rather than what you actually did." Marcus considered that. Then, in the same flat, unhurried tone he used for everything, he told her, "The discrepancy in the hydraulic readout, the 2 signatures, 1 day apart, the original shortcut 2 years earlier, made to save 4 days of downtime." The report he'd filed through the proper channel before he'd ever been accused of anything. The termination email that arrived less than 18 hours later, before anyone had asked him a single question about what he'd actually found. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Do you still have the original documentation, before it was amended?" "I do. I'd like to see it." "I'll send it to your personal email," Marcus said. Not the Meridian system. It was a small thing, that distinction, but Vivian understood exactly what it meant. He didn't trust her system. After 14 months of Kane running it, she was beginning not to either. She drove to his house the next morning, unannounced, which was not something chief executives of regional airlines typically did, and which surprised her own assistant considerably more than it surprised Marcus, who opened the door already holding a folder, as though he'd expected this might eventually happen. Or, at least had prepared for the possibility, without expecting it. Pod. Della was at the kitchen table finishing breakfast before school, and she looked up at the woman in the expensive coat, with the particular unimpressed curiosity of a 9-year-old who has learned that adults in expensive coats are not automatically trustworthy. "This is Miss Cross," Marcus told her. "She runs the airline I used to work for." "Used to," Della repeated, and went back to her cereal, which struck Vivian as more honest commentary than anything she'd heard from anyone on her own staff in 14 months. Marcus laid the folder out on the workbench in the garage, rather than the kitchen table, which Vivian understood without being told, was where he did the parts of his life that required precision. The original inspection sheet, the 2 conflicting signatures, the timestamp on his internal safety report, filed hours before Kane's termination memo was drafted. And beneath all of it, a printed record of the amended file that had replaced the original in Meridian's internal system less than a day after his firing. The second signature quietly removed, the discrepancy smoothed into something that looked, on the surface, like routine maintenance. Vivian went through the documents twice. The first time she read them, the way she read most reports, scanning for the shape of what had happened. The second time she read them slowly, tracing the dates against each other, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had fired a man for finding exactly the kind of problem she should have been paying him to find, on the word of the one person in her company who had the most to lose if that problem ever surfaced. "I need copies of this," she said. "You can have them," Marcus said. "I made 3. "Why 3? "Because I've learned that important things disappear when only one copy exists." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. There was no bitterness in the statement. It was simply a fact. delivered the way he seemed to deliver every fact, without decoration, without asking for sympathy. "I'm going to need you to come back to Meridian," she said, "not as a favor, as a witness, and I think, when this is finished, as a captain, if you're willing." "I'll think about the captain part," Marcus said. "The witness part isn't optional. Somebody almost got on a plane with a bad hydraulic seal because a man wanted to save 4 days, 2 years ago. That doesn't stay quiet because I got fired." Vivian nodded slowly. It was the first time in 14 months that anyone had spoken to her about her own airline like it mattered more than the org chart sitting beneath it. She left with the folder. She did not leave with an apology fully formed because she understood, in the way Marcus seemed to understand most things, that an apology without corrective action was just another kind of noise. Kane did not know yet that the ground beneath him had shifted. He spent the next 4 days assembling the sanitized maintenance history for the FAA's request, confident that the amended records would hold, unaware that Vivian now possessed the originals, and unaware that Prayashaw's corroborating statement had already been forwarded, quietly, to the FAA's regional investigator by an inspector who had grown tired of watching safety concerns disappear into Kane's office over the years. The board meeting that would end Kane's career at Meridian Air was scheduled, ostensibly, as a routine quarterly review. Vivian made sure of that. She wanted Kane in the room, comfortable, prepared to deliver the kind of confident update he'd delivered 100 times before, because she understood, by now, that men like Kane performed best when they believed no one was actually checking. The morning of the meeting, Vivian called Marcus directly and asked him to be there, not to testify formally, simply to be present with his documentation, in case the board had questions that only he could answer honestly. Marcus arrived in a plain suit, not a uniform, carrying a single folder, and took a seat near the back of the boardroom, where Kane did not notice him until the meeting was well underway, and where Prayashaw, arriving separately at Vivian's quiet request, sat 2 seats down from him. Kane opened with a summary of operational performance for the quarter. On-time departures were up. Costs were down. He mentioned, in passing, a minor staffing correction in the flight operations department, a brief, almost bored reference to a termination that had, he assured the board, resolved itself cleanly. Vivian let him finish. Then she said, "I'd like to revisit that staffing correction." Kane's expression shifted by perhaps 1/10 of a degree, the kind of adjustment only someone already watching closely would catch. The pilot in question flagged a hydraulic discrepancy on Flight 118 10 days ago, Vivian said. A discrepancy that traced back to a maintenance shortcut approved 2 years prior. I have the original inspection documentation. I have the amended version that replaced it in our system less than a day after his termination. I'd like to understand how those 2 documents came to differ. The room went very still. Kane recovered quickly, the way men who have talked their way out of trouble for 11 years tend to. He explained smoothly that documentation gets updated regularly as part of standard quality control, that discrepancies in early drafts were common and didn't necessarily reflect anything improper, that he'd have to review the specific files before commenting further, and that he found it concerning that a terminated employee's account was being given this much weight in a board setting without proper verification. "It has been verified," Vivian said. "That's why we're having this conversation." She turned to Marcus. "Captain Webb, would you walk the board through what you found?" Marcus stood, opened his folder, and spoke the way he always spoke. Without heat, without performance, he described the pressure reading, the 2 signatures, a day apart, the 2-year-old service history that the readout didn't match. He described filing the report through the proper channel and receiving a termination notice less than 18 hours later before anyone had asked him a single clarifying question about what he'd found. Then Priyashaw spoke, confirming the sequence, confirming that she'd flagged the initial reading to him herself, confirming that his report matched exactly what she'd observed and documented independently. Then, Vivian placed the original inspection sheet on the table next to the amended version currently sitting in Meridian's official system, side by side, so that the missing signature was visible to everyone in the room without needing to be explained twice. Kane looked at the 2 documents for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, with the particular calm of a man who has run out of smooth things to say that he would need to consult with legal counsel before continuing this discussion. That was, functionally, a confession, and everyone in the room understood it as one. The board did not need much more than that. A senior board member, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had sat on Meridian's board since its founding 26 years earlier, alongside Vivian's father, spoke for the first time in the meeting. She said that she remembered, 26 years ago, sitting in a much smaller room with Vivian's father, drawing up the company's original operating principles, and that the very first one, written in his own hand and framed still in the lobby of the original Meridian office that almost nobody visited anymore, was that no cost-saving measure would ever be approved at the expense of a documented safety concern. She said she wanted that document pulled out of storage and put back in the current headquarters, somewhere people would actually see it. Then she made a motion to suspend Kane immediately, pending full investigation, and to formally reinstate Marcus Webb with full back pay and a public correction to his personnel record. The motion passed unanimously. Kane was escorted from the building that afternoon by building security, carrying a box of desk items past the same gate agents and pilots who had spent 11 years being quietly afraid of him, none of whom said a word as he left, which was, in its own way, the loudest possible response. The FAA's investigation, once granted full access to both the original and amended maintenance records, confirmed everything Marcus had documented. Meridian was fined for the original shortcut and required to submit to an extended compliance review, but the swift internal correction, the whistleblower protection that had already been properly followed, and Vivian's full cooperation once the truth surfaced were noted favorably, and the airline avoided the kind of penalty that ends companies rather than merely humbling them. Vivian offered Marcus a position 2 weeks later, not simply reinstatement as a line captain, though that was on the table too. She offered him a newly created role, Director of Flight Safety and Standards, reporting directly to her, with authority to review any maintenance or operational decision company-wide, independent of the normal operations chain that Kane had spent 11 years quietly controlling. Marcus read the offer twice. The first time, the way anyone reads an offer like that, scanning for the shape of the opportunity. The second time, slower, weighing what it would mean. More money. More authority. Considerably less time in the actual cockpit, which was the thing that had brought him to aviation in the first place, long before any of this. He met with Vivian in her office to discuss it, and he was direct, the way he was direct about everything. "I'll take the role," he said, "on 2 conditions. Name them. First, I still fly. Not every week, but regularly. I didn't spend 22 years in the air to trade it for a desk permanently." "Agreed," Vivian said. "What's the second?" "The safety role reports to the board directly, not just to you. I don't want it to depend on whoever happens to be sitting in your chair 5 years from now, believing in it as much as you do today." Vivian considered that for a moment and then found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she respected the request more than she would have respected simple gratitude. "Done," she said. The role was written into Meridian's governance structure within a month. An independent flight safety authority with direct board reporting, a structural change that outside aviation analysts later cited as unusually rigorous for a regional carrier, its size, and one that effectively made it impossible for a future version of Russell Kane to operate unwatched for 11 years, the way the real one had. 6 months later, Marcus flew a ride-eye into Denver, the same route Flight 118 would have taken that first morning, and Della came to the airport to meet him afterward, because it was a Saturday, and she liked watching the planes land from the observation window near the gate, a small ritual the two of them had built since the whole ordeal began. Vivian met them there too, ostensibly to review a compliance report Marcus had filed that week, though the report could easily have waited until Monday, and both of them understood that, without needing to say it aloud. They sat together at a small table near the window, Della between them with a hot chocolate, narrating the landing pattern of an incoming aircraft, with the confident authority of a 9-year-old who had absorbed more aviation vocabulary in 6 months than most adults learn in a lifetime. Vivian asked Marcus at one point quietly whether he'd ever expected any of this, the role, the reporting structure, any of it. "No," Marcus said. "I expected to fly. I expected to do it right." Everything after that was just other people catching up to what should have been obvious from the start. Vivian didn't argue with that. She'd learned, over 6 months, that arguing with Marcus Webb about a fact was generally a losing proposition, mostly because he rarely stated one he hadn't already checked twice. Outside the window, the aircraft touched down, smooth and unremarkable, exactly the way a landing is supposed to look when everything beneath it has been done correctly. Della cheered anyway, the way she cheered every landing, because to her, it still felt like something worth celebrating. Marcus watched the plane taxi toward the gate, and for a moment his face did something it rarely did in front of other people. It settled, entirely, into something like peace, not triumph. He'd never much cared for triumph, just the quiet, ordinary satisfaction of watching something land the way it was supposed to, built by people who had finally been made to do the work correctly, whether they'd wanted to or not.